from day one in a very, very social world. And so what that means is the way that those behaviors or sub-micro personalities start to organize themselves is always under the influence of the society in which they're embedded. And so, you know, Piaget talked about the child as being as having basic built-in reflexes at birth, and that those reflexes are then elaborated up into more and more complex structures. But you can think that even the elaboration of those basic reflexes, even right from the beginning, like there's a rooting and sucking reflex, which you can elicit from a child by tapping on the side of its cheek when it's very newly born, and it'll search to try to put what's tapping in its mouth. And that's part of the reflexive process, the built-in perceptual motor unit that allows the child to begin to suckle. Now the thing is, though, what it's suckling isn't a static and objective entity, it's a person. And part of breastfeeding is the establishment of a relationship, a complex relationship, because it's also not only a feeding relationship, it's a caring relationship, it's a relationship that's based on tactile interaction. There can be nervousness associated with it, and often is, especially for a new mother. It's a very complex, dynamic social act. And so what that means is that right from the beginning, in order for the baby to engage in that process properly, it has to allow its initial reflexive movements to be modified by social necessity immediately. So for example, if a baby is breastfeeding, it can't bite. And you know, it doesn't have any teeth, so being bitten isn't necessarily a catastrophe, but it's not pleasant. And so what will happen if the baby bites the mother is that the mother will pull away and startle the baby, and then the baby will cry, and you know, the mother will be at least startled by the error. And so the baby has to learn to be civilized in some sense right off the bat. Now, you know, when Freud was talking about the process of socialization, he tended to concentrate more on toilet training, you know, because he thought of that as the first place where the first major place where the id of the child, which Rogers would regard as the organismic experiential domain, is brought under control of the superego, right? Because the baby, obviously, its fundamental biological function is to relieve itself, but that has to come under very, very strict social control. And it's a complex form of learning. You know, it's basically the acquisition of voluntary control over what was heretofore an involuntary reflex, essentially. And so that can go well or it can go badly, and it can go very badly. So I knew a family who had a daughter at one point, and that daughter would only defecate in her diaper when she was 3. So that meant she had full voluntary control of her bowel function, but there was no way she was going to participate in the social ritual that surrounded proper toileting. There was a war going on, like a serious war. And that sort of thing happens, well, not infrequently. And of course, you remember in the Crumb movie, the mother, the boys accusing the mother of giving them enemas, and her, of course, denying that any such thing happened, which was something that made both of them roll their eyes. You know, and they all laughed, but it's really not particularly amusing. So, anyways, my point is that even at the micro level, the manifestation of what we'll call micro-personalities expands and organizes into an environment that's conditioned by social expectation. Okay, so then, and this is something we haven't talked about before, one thing you might ask is, okay, where does the social expectation come from? Now, that's a very complex question, because in some sense that's the same question as where does culture come from? And that's partly a complex question because you have to take into account evolutionary history, which provides the substrata for the development of culture, so that would be human biology. You have to take that into account. And then you have to take human history into account, and where what you don't have to take into account is not clear, right? Because it's very difficult to track the origins of the social routines that make up the fundamental social contract. You know, we know how to behave properly, roughly speaking. We have a set of expectations and a set of wants about the way that other people are going to behave with regards to us, and they return the favor. And everyone is participating in this, and everybody basically knows it, unless they're very poorly socialized, and you can usually tell that right away. You know, kids can tell that, because if a 3-year-old is playing with another 3-year-old, and one of them is poorly socialized, and so maybe has the behavioral repertoire of a fairly badly behaved 2-year-old, the other 3-year-old, being socially sophisticated, will say, will not play with the first one. So, even though they might be perfectly happy to play for a time with an actual 2-year-old. So, it doesn't take very long. It's really at about the age of 3 that children are already sophisticated enough to have embodied the rules that constitute appropriate cultural behavior. And those rules, or they're patterns actually, they're not exactly rules for the child, because the child couldn't explicitly state them, but they can act them out. Now you remember, Piaget talked about this a fair bit, right? Because he said that part of the way that the slightly larger micro-personalities, say of a 2-year-old, are integrated into the broader social world is through games that are played with peers and with older children. And the games are ways that, like a game is fundamentally a negotiated sphere of action and perception that has a particular goal, and the goal is defined by the players, and the sphere of interaction is defined by the players. And so then if you're a good player, what happens is that you become part of a higher order structure, and the higher order structure is the game. So if you're playing soccer, all of a sudden, if you're civilized, what you do is you manifest those behaviors that are appropriate to playing soccer, and you voluntarily subordinate your individuality at that point to the higher order structure of the game that's a communal agreement. So it's a basic social contract. And so you practice being part of basic social contracts by playing games. And you can do that with games that are, in some sense, relatively straightforward and regulated by strict conventions and articulated rules. And so that would be like a soccer game. Or you can do it in a more complex way and a less structured and less articulated manner by engaging in dramatic play. And so what children usually do when they're doing that is that they'll gather around a little group and they'll lay out the drama. So the drama would be, we're going to simulate X. We're going to simulate a family. And then everybody is assigned a role. And so you're supposed to act out your role, but exactly how you're supposed to act it out is left open during the game. So you can riff and improvise. And basically what children are doing when they're doing that is acting out the family. And, because they need to get the family in their bones, because being a parent isn't a set of ideas about parenting, it's a set of behaviors. It's a dance that you learn to have with your children and with your partner. And it's very complicated, and the rules go far beyond what you could ever articulate. Because you can ask yourself a question like, well, how should you discipline a child? Well, first of all, you can argue about that forever. But second of all, you cannot actually elaborate a set of principles that will guide your behavior in every situation where a child is likely to disrupt the social circumstance. So you have to be smarter than you can say in order to be good at doing something as complicated as disciplining a child. Because discipline also means encouraging, right? Because part of discipline is, well, you shouldn't do those things, but another part of it is you should definitely do more of those things. And so it's the inculcation of a moral code, and a lot of that's done through nonverbal behavior and through providing a role model for spontaneous imitation and all sorts of things that aren't verbal. Okay, now, so Piaget talked about the game, and then you could think that games become more and more complex and more abstract and more like real life as you mature, until maybe the games transform into what sociologists would refer to as roles. So the role you're playing at the moment, at least in principle, is student. And, it's a game, and it's a game because it's a fiction in some sense. It's a fiction, it's a dramatic fiction in some sense. The only reason that it exists as a role is because society is structured in such a way that enables you to do what you're doing and to live at the same time. So it's not exactly adaptation to the normal, to the natural world in any sense of the, in any sense of the word. But it's also real life, or maybe it's almost as close to real life as you ever get, because almost everything that modern people do, and maybe this is true for a long time into the past, is game-like in its structure. So the games just get more and more and more, they're more and more encompassing in some sense, but you can almost say that it never comes to the point where what you're doing is no longer playing a game. Now that's a bit of an oversimplification, but because there are games and metagames, but we won't talk about the metagames at the moment. Okay, so now you can understand sort of some of the lower order games, and you can even understand some of the higher order roles. Like you could basically articulate in some sense what it means to be a student. But if you go up the hierarchy, because good person, a subset of good person could be good student, you can kind of articulate what it means to be a good student, although you can't fully articulate it. But if you go at levels above that, like be a good citizen or be a good person, it gets more and more difficult to fully articulate because, of course, it's more and more abstract and it encompasses more and more territory. And so by the time you're at the top of the hierarchy, so to speak, be a good person, well, it's a much more complex phenomena than you can articulate. It can't be fully articulated. Now, I want to read you something that Nietzsche said.